Journey through time and uncover the events, people, and civilizations that shaped our world. Welcome to the Vault of History.
Welcome to The Explainer. You know, we're all pretty familiar with the history of the fall of the Third Reich, right? The major battles, the Nuremberg trials, that definitive end to a truly devastating era. It's a story we've been told countless times. But today, we're going to dive into a rarely told and honestly, genuinely shocking aspect of the aftermath. What actually happened to the women who stood right beside the architects of that regime? It's a fascinating and often completely overlooked piece of history. Okay, let's dive into this. Picture the year 1945. Total collapse. The men who engineered this horrific chapter of history faced some very immediate, stark realities. They were either dead, captured, or sitting in a courtroom facing trial for their actions. That part of the historical timeline, it's firmly established and highly visible. But that leaves us with a glaring, unanswered question. What happened to their wives? Once the dust finally settled, where did they actually go? The 8 women we're looking at today carried the history, the secrets, and the legacy of the regime long after 1945. But, as you'll see, they navigated the post-war world in vastly different ways. Their paths were incredibly divergent. We're talking about secret lives in exile, decades-long campaigns to rewrite history, and women who simply faded into completely invisible lives. Part 1. Fading into obscurity. Let's move to and see how this builds with our first group of women, those who essentially vanished. Let's start with Margarete von Lieb. She belonged firmly to Germany's military aristocracy. We're talking about the deeply rooted, generational elite. This wasn't just some political appointment for her family. This was an entrenched status built on historic land, incredible wealth, and centuries of tradition. So the collapse of the Third Reich impacted her reality with devastating immediacy. For Marguerite, an entire world of privilege, vast estates, and virtually untouchable influence disappeared almost overnight. Imagine that. One day, you're sitting at the absolute pinnacle of an aristocratic military society, and the very next, the entire structure holding you up is simply gone forever. Now, what's really interesting about this contrast is what we see with the Rosenbergs. Alfred Rosenberg was the chief ideologue. He actively shaped Hitler's worldview, laying the groundwork for some of the regime's darkest policies. He was highly visible, deeply influential. Yet his wife, Hedwig Rosenberg, became almost entirely invisible. How does someone situated so incredibly close to the absolute center of power just manage to disappear completely from the historical record? Then you have Julius Streicher, notoriously one of history's most prominent anti-Semites, and the publisher of the hate-filled Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer, which constantly spewed venom into the public consciousness. But look at his wife, Adele Streicher. Much like Hedwig Rosenberg, the exact moment the war ended, she completely stepped out of the massive shadow of her husband's infamy and into total obscurity. She literally vanished from public view. Part 2. Defenders of the legacy. To really understand this next dynamic, we have to look at how history treated Erwin Rommel. After World War II, he was viewed by millions not as a fanatic, but as a military legend. He was often wrapped up in this post-war myth of the good German who supposedly maintained his honor. That specific post-war framing sets some absolutely crucial context for his wife's actions in the decades that followed. Because standing right behind that enduring image was his wife, Eleanor Rommel. She definitely wasn't just a passive observer watching history being written. Oh no, she actively curated his papers, meticulously managed his public perception, and deliberately shaped that Rommel myth for decades after his death. Now contrast Rommel's legacy with that of Alfred Jodl. Jodl met a highly definitive, very public end. Execution at Nuremberg. That absolute judgment by the international community makes his wife's subsequent path incredibly notable. So the crucial point is this. Most people in that situation, they might just try to escape the stigma and disappear. But Louise Jodl dug in. She spent decades writing letters, battling historians, gathering sympathetic documents, and actively campaigning to clear Alfred Jodl's name, long after the regime had ceased to exist.
Part 3. Fleeing into hiding.
The prime example of this has gotta be Veronika Eichmann. When the regime finally fell, she faced a massive crossroads and made a deliberate, incredibly high-stakes choice. Rather than quietly separating herself from him to start a fresh life, she chose to uproot absolutely everything. She followed her husband Adolf Eichmann deep into hiding, choosing a life of permanent secrecy. And this brilliantly illustrates just how dramatic things got. They fled across the world to Argentina, successfully hiding under the radar for years. But then, the timeline abruptly fractures. In a matter of minutes, Adolf was captured on the street by Mossad. Months later, he was in Israel, standing trial. In a flash, their clandestine life was permanently over. Part 4. The Active Ideologues. There's a pretty common historical assumption out there that the wives of these leaders were merely passive observers, just quietly standing in the background while their husbands called the shots. But that simply isn't true. Not every leader's wife stayed out of politics. Some were fundamental, driving members of the regime's inner elite in their own right. Take a look at this date, 1925. That is the year Elise Hildebrand officially joined the Nazi Party. Think about that context. That is years before Hitler even took power in Germany, back when the movement was still just a chaotic fringe group. Her early entry proves a deep, independent ideological commitment that lasted throughout the entire existence of the regime. Similarly, Elfriede Conti was not a bystander by any stretch of the imagination. She was actually awarded the Nazi Party's Golden Badge. This was a highly elite honor, earned specifically for her active, tangible support and her deep involvement in the political apparatus of the time. And here is a truly shocking number to wrap your head around: 60. Elfriede Conti survived for nearly 60 years after the total collapse of the Third Reich. Just pause and think about that. For 6 whole decades, she walked around carrying that direct history and that active ideological past right with her into the modern era. Part 5. A complicated historical legacy. So, what does this all mean? When the architects of a regime fall, how do we genuinely reckon with those who quietly carry its legacy forward into the future? Whether they disappeared entirely like Hedwig and Adele, fiercely defended a reputation like Eleonora and Louise, fled across oceans like Veronica, or lived silently with an elite badge for 60 years like Elfriede, these 8 women highlight a complex and totally overlooked chapter of history. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll catch you on the next Explainer.
History never ends, it only continues through time. Thank you for watching The Vault of History.